Hi, everybody. We have a special guest with us today. He is host of his YouTube show, Economic Update Democracy at Work, and he's the author of many books, including his most recent, The System is the Sickness When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Please welcome to the show, Professor Richard Wolff. Good to see
Glad
you.
to be here, Jimmy.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming back to the show. Now, I always wish I had you on speed dial because I always have questions for you. So I had this gentleman on, David Sachs, and we were talking about the banks, the SVP crash and stuff like that. And so he was saying that he wanted them to bail out the banks, meaning he wanted them to cover the depositors, not the investors, and fire all the people running it. But he wanted to save the depositors. Now, what's your take on that whole debacle, by the way? And do you think that was the right course?
Well, I think that the place to start is the weird way we handle money. Everybody knows that money makes the world go round. That's why we have phrases like that. We need it. We need it for our business every day. We need to be able to borrow it. We need to be able to have confidence in it. Everybody understands that money is a social institution that we all rely on in more ways than we can count. Okay, if it's a social need for all of us, why in the world would anyone in their right mind create institutions called banks that are in the business of handing out money, managing money, collecting deposits, making loans, when the goal of these institutions is the private profit for their shareholders and the private profit for the people who set them up? What you're doing is creating social dependency on people who are not there to make this system work. They're there to make money. And they take risks to do that. And if they take those risks and they don't work out, like the Silicon Valley Bank, well, then we get what American history has every few years, a bank collapse. In the 19th century, we used to call them bank panics. That was a better word because it gave you the truth of what was going on here. After each of them, we passed some regulatory laws. Then, in a funny way, they kind of fade away. Banks learn how to get around them. If they need to, they buy the politicians to amend them or to repeal them. And then we get back to square one, and the private banks go in there to make their money. And 5 to 6 to 7 years later, boom, the system goes again. I mean, you kind of have to scratch your head and say, after this happens over and over again, are you really going to go back to the way things were? And the answer is yes, because that's what's been done every other time. And look, if the private banks making money call the shots, then every one of these is a wonderful example. You call the government in, it cleans up the mess you left behind and sets everything up for this game to be played again.
And so what's the solution? I thought the solution would be like they have, I think, in North Dakota, they have state banks.
That's right.
So go ahead, tell people what that is.
Yeah, it's a wonderful example. So I could give you examples from a lot of other countries that have handled this in other ways, but I don't have to. I have a nice state that very few Americans know much about, North Dakota, which over 100 years ago, I believe it was 1916 or around then, set up its own bank. It didn't want the private banks to be doing this game all the time. So they set up a public bank. It was designed to serve the people of North Dakota. It's largely a rural state, so a lot of the lending was for farmers and the rural people in agriculture, but there were also industries and there were also the usual. And the way it was set up was serve the people in this area called North Dakota. And if you make any money, here comes the good part, if you're profitable, That profit goes into the budget of the state of North Dakota, which means it has to raise fewer taxes on the people and businesses of North Dakota because the bank servicing those same businesses and people made a profit, but that's not going to go into some private hustler's pocket. It's going to serve the people of North Dakota. And over the last 100 years, all of the private banks around the whole United States have waged one campaign after another to stop this because it's a dangerous example. And I'm here to tell you, even conservative Republicans don't touch that. The Democrats don't, the Republicans don't. It's like political third rail on the railroad system. Don't go near there. Anyone who attacked or tried to get the end of that system has been pushed aside by the people of North Dakota, and it's as successful today as it was 100 years ago, and never has the kinds of problems that we are regularly experiencing with our private banking system.
And so, is that the only state that has a state bank? Is North?
Yes, it's the only state. Yeah, no, it's unbelievable, and I won't embarrass anybody by asking, not that we could, but I'm not going to ask your audience, raise your hand if you knew that this was going on.
I didn't.
Not only is it the only state, but there is really something, if not a conspiracy, well, then there's a comfortable decision by large numbers of our mass media not to make a big deal out of this, not to, for example, take advantage of this moment with collapse of Silicon, collapse of Signature Bank, collapse of the Credit Suisse in Switzerland, to tell us all, gee, there is already another way to go. It's been in this country for over a century. It's a roaring success, and we are therefore going to tell you nothing about it.
So, without doing that, so in the short term, when SVB Bank and those other banks started failing, if you were the head of the person in charge, what would you have done? You would have covered the depositors or no?
Yes, I would have covered the depositors because otherwise you set up a cascading catastrophe that gets bigger literally by the hour. By the way, footnote, we're not out of the woods yet either. Far from it. But for the moment, you can at least take the initial step of not penalizing the people who have put, their life savings, their business capital, whatever else it is, into these banks, who assumed that there is this thing which we call in economics of banking fiduciary duty. In other words, if you've got other people's money, you're supposed to be super careful and cautious because you've been entrusted. It's one thing to risk your own, but you're not supposed to take undue risks. And there's a presumption. What was going on here was that an awful lot of people, not just the bankers themselves, but the supervisory apparatus that's supposed to regulate what we know is a constantly churning pit of either corruption or incompetence, those people were blind too at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco. So the whole system, the private bank and the regulatory apparatus, really messed up. And look, people are saying these are small banks. They weren't. The Silicon Valley Bank is either the 15th or 16th largest bank in the United States. Signature was another one like that. These are not small banks. And already many other banks are shaking because of the fear of what their depositors may do if they get frightened about the security of what they have. And one more thing, Jimmy, look at this. This is another bailout. They're careful not to call it that, but we're bailing out another failed private enterprise using the government, its guarantees, its money, its resources, its time, its energy. Wow. And we're not getting much for it since we're letting these banks continue. We're letting other banks buy them. with no guarantee that the banks doing the buying are not going to do the same kind of behavior that they've all been doing for so long anyway. It's an amazing thing to watch.
Well, it's because this is what I try to tell people is that they don't realize that, our government, they think our government is regular corrupt. Like Joe Biden got his kid a no-show job at an energy board in Ukraine, or Donald Trump set up his kid with a business deal in Saudi Arabia. But what they don't realize is that the whole thing, every law that gets written, the whole Defense Department budget is nothing but corruption. What do you think $800 billion a year is going for a country? We have no enemies threatening us. We're surrounded by waters in Canada and Mexico. We have nobody threatening. We spend $1 trillion. We have 1,000 military bases. That's all corruption. Banking, the reason why banks keep failing every couple of years is because they own the politicians who write the regulations. And when the banks fail, the government comes in and fixes them, and nobody goes to jail. That's because we live in 100% corrupt government. And why can they send $100 billion to another failing bank or to Ukraine, to another proxy war at the snap of a finger before they take half that money and fix homelessness in their own country? It's because there's no corruption greasing the wheels of fixing homelessness. That's why. And
Can't
people
make as much money in it.
That's right. That's right. I mean, if we could bomb the homeless, there's always money for that. So now, but you have no other choice. So the reason
By the way, Jimmy, if I could just add one thing, because it just amplifies your point. We're supposed to be a country that is worried about a big other problem they haven't solved called inflation. Prices are going up. Everybody knows it. The supermarket, the gas station, wherever you turn, we are suffering because wages are not going up as fast as prices, and therefore our standard of living is being squeezed. Okay, what's the worst thing you can do if there's already rising prices? Answer: pour money into the system, new, fresh money. It's like pouring kerosene on a fire that you want to go out. That's not a good method. So look what happens here. The people pull their deposits out of those failing banks. They still have that money. They're going to put it in another bank. That money is there. But now the government comes in and says, we'll cover. Don't you worry, all you people. We're basically going to give these banks a ton of new money at the Federal Reserve to use to cover all. That's more money. Mm-hmm. You're pumping more money. The same government that wants to curtail inflation is boosting the inflation by its method of trying to solve the banking problem. What you begin to see is we are so far down the path of economic decline that we're like a very old sick person. We have too many diseases, and the attempt to solve one clashes with the medicine for the other one. At a certain point, the doctors say, hey, we're beyond ability to save this patient. Your frustration with what you just said, that's a rational response to a network of problems that are now feeding on each other. We can't solve one without worsening it. If you hear the excuse of the bankers, it was the interest rates going up that had a part to do with their Yeah, but we raised interest rates to try to deal with the inflation. Now we got to deal with the banks in a way that worsens the inflation. It's becoming literally ridiculous.
So in order to curtail inflation, which was brought on in large part by them dumping trillions of dollars into the economy, not into the workers' pockets, but into people who put that money into Wall Street and what have you.
Right.
So that causes inflation. So now to curtail inflation, they rise interest rates. Interest rates now make those banks fail because the banks put all their money into bonds that are low interest rates long term.
Right. And so they go down in value when they raise the interest rate.
So those go down in value. So now they can't, when somebody comes to withdraw their money, they have to cash in those bonds to pay that money. And those bonds are now worthless because of the interest rates being so high. So now, they're trying to curb inflation. They raise interest rates, makes the banks fail. So in order to fix the banks, they throw money at the banks, which causes more inflation.
Right. It's really you kind of throw up your hands that otherwise intelligent people who understand these things. You know, it's the first I've taught these courses. The first semester of a banking course, you learn about the interest rate goes up and the value of the bond goes down. That's not rocket science. That's not an advanced understanding. Anybody in a bank who runs a bank knows it. They're the institutions that buy those long-term bonds, the major ones, on and on. There's no excuse for any of this. By the way, if I have a moment, let me do two things that you may find humorous. Okay.
Okay.
The first one is, well, I got my PhD in economics to be a professor at Yale University years ago. And in my class with me at the same time that I got my PhD at Yale University was a young woman who went and had the same courses, the same lectures, everything as I did. Her name was Janet Yellen. That's right. So I can assure you she knows about rising interest rates and falling bonds. She knows everything that I know because we were taught literally the same thing by the same professor at the same time. So I'm looking at a system that is so out of control that a perfectly well-educated economist like herself is at a loss of kind of what to do. And then it gets even weirder, because here's what we learned. When you have an inflation, there are multiple different ways that societies have used to try to cope with inflation. Raising interest rates has never been the only one. It has never been the one that you just do. That's crazy. So I'm watching this woman who knows better up there talking like Mr. Powell does, as if this were the only thing to do. Let me give you an example. August 15th, 1971, President Richard M. Nixon gets on the radio and television, and here's what he says to the American people. We have a bad inflation, which we did at that time, and it has to be stopped, which it did at that time. And I'm going to do what has to be done, which he did at that time. Now, here's what he said. If anyone, as of when I stop speaking now, if any business raises its price of anything it sells, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and you're going to jail. Any union or organization of workers that tries to push up wages, we will do the same. This thing was called a wage price freeze. It didn't happen in another country. It happened in the U.S. when a conservative Republican president did this, okay? So anyone who says raising interest rates is what you have to do, that's not true. And both Mr. Powell and Janet Yellen know that because they learned it the same way I did. And there are other policies. They all have strengths and weaknesses. I'm not arguing do A or don't do B, but to act the way this country does, as if raising interest rates is the only thing we can do, that is a lie. That is not true. And that's a disservice to the American people because we don't have any discussion or debate about which of these policies we want to use. Had we not raised interest rates, for example, we would not have plunged these banks into this kind of crisis. That'd be an interesting aspect of making a decision about what policy to use. And if we really care about the inequality of income, what we could have done is freeze the prices, allow the wages to go up a little bit, and that would have done a good bit to correct the inequality that has gotten so much worse in recent decades.
Kurt, go ahead.
Was the goal to ruin those banks? I know it sounds suspicious, like it sounds conspiratorial, but is that the idea? We want to kill those banks?
So I mean, it's an obvious question, right? So if Janet Yellen knows this, that raising those interest rates are going to cause some banks to fail, and yet they do it anyways, what could possibly be the thinking there?
I hate to say it because I don't mean to frighten people, but I got to be honest with you. Otherwise, you're not going to invite me back here. I think they're desperate. I don't think they take the time. I don't think they take the space. This inflation, let me remind you, when the inflation began, which was already late 2021, early 2022, the Federal Reserve officially told us not to worry. It's not going to be severe. It isn't going to last. It's nothing. They kept that story up until it was so obviously wrong that they had to do something. And now they had waited, and they did what they felt they could do right there on the spot. They probably don't want the political storm. Business doesn't want to be told you can't raise your prices. They yelled and screamed at Nixon when he did it, but they behaved. The inflation came down. It's not a policy that doesn't have a lot to say for it, but I don't think they wanted the time. They didn't want to debate. They wanted to get in there and stop what had become a serious political and economic problem that they had waited too long to deal with.
Okay. It doesn't look good. I never know where to put your savings. Where are you supposed to put your money? I have no idea.
I got to live in North Dakota.
Go to jimmydore.com to see my new stand-up special, COVID Lies Are Funny. For only $10, you get to become a premium member, too. And come see us do our live shows. We're going to be doing stand-up comedy in Milwaukee, Nashville, Honolulu, Los Angeles, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, New York, Cohoes, New York, Hartford, Connecticut, Baltimore, Maryland, and more. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets.